Welcome to our Beer U module on the British beer culture. The British Isles are widely considered to be one of the great brewing areas of the world, and much beer history was written here. The history of British beer is lengthy, unique, and very influential in beer culture around the world. The British Isles are comprised of two nations, the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom itself is comprised of England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. We'll consider them together as they have largely developed their brewing history together, but there are also many interesting and unique elements that each area has contributed to the brewing culture. Beer has a very long history in the British Isles. The Neolithic site at Skara Brae in the Orkney Islands of Scotland contains the earliest known evidence of fermented beverages anywhere in Northern Europe. Excavations there have uncovered evidence of barley and herbs being used to create an ancient ale at least as far back as 2500 BC. The Skara Brae beverage was likely an ale that was flavored with herbs, much like the drink that we know today as gruit. In other parts of the British Isles, ciders and meads were popular for centuries. Some barley-based beers brewed with hops also existed, but were not as common as ciders, meads, and gruit. Barley-based beer was rare because the large and dense forests of Britain made it difficult to grow barley and other grains that would have been needed to make those beers, and hops were not always readily available to ancient brewers. Ancient fermented beverages, like the Skara Brae beverage, were often flavored with a variety of herbs instead of hops. This was commonly known as gruit. Gruit would have been very common in the British Isles for thousands of years, and it was popular until hops became common in the 15th and 16th centuries. Today there are still a few examples of gruit brewed commercially, including heather-based versions brewed in Scotland. Grand changes in the beer culture started to occur in the 5th century with the arrival of Anglo-Saxon immigrants from the western coast of Europe. The invading Anglo-Saxons brought with them a brewing tradition that was largely built around barley-based beers. They also brought with them the agricultural knowledge and tradition of growing barley that would fuel their beer brewing passion. In short order, the previous traditions of cider and mead were pushed to the background in the areas that the Anglo-Saxons settled. As British brewers began to adopt hops as a key beer ingredient beginning in the 14th century, hopped beers competed for a time with their herb-flavored cousins and eventually overtook them in popularity. Beers flavored with herbs, what we call gruit today, were commonly referred to as ales during this time, with the term beer being reserved for their hopped counterparts. Lagers were considered separately, as they came from continental Europe and fell outside of the British brewing tradition. Even today, advertisements can still be seen referencing ales, beers, and lagers, a phrase that alludes to variations of beer that were once considered very different. Today, we consider ales and lagers to be different types of beer. During the Middle Ages, monasteries contributed greatly to the local communities around them. They helped to provide education and sustenance that often included beer that was shared with villagers or pilgrims traveling to visit holy sites around Britain and beyond. European monasteries are still brewing beer in some cases and have been doing so for hundreds of years. Monasteries not only brewed beer, but they often enhanced the techniques of brewing and agriculture involved in that process. In some cases, the brewing of beer could provide substantial income to the monastery. Building on the growing popularity of beer in the Middle Ages, brewing and serving houses began to emerge known as ale houses. Ale houses specialized in beer, but some began to provide other services and even became inns that provided food and shelter for travelers in addition to beer. Many ale houses were operated by brewsters, also called alewives. These female brewers would hang an ale stake or ale wand outside the house to let customers know that the beer was ready to be served. Pubs evolved from ale houses and inns. Today, the pub is a very traditional and integral part of British life. Pubs have become social centers in their communities, with some people spending hours each day in the pub socializing and conducting business. Many relationships and ideas have been forged in pubs. In the last couple of centuries, in the British Isles, it has been common for pubs to be tied houses. That means that they are owned directly by a brewery or financed in some way by a brewery. Because of this arrangement, brewers had a virtually guaranteed source of sales, since the tied houses typically featured only the beer that the financing brewery produced. Free houses are not financed by a brewery and are free to choose which beers they wish to sell. The Industrial Revolution changed the brewing industry dramatically, while brewing also had a very big impact on the Industrial Revolution. As laborers gathered in large cities like London, brewers found a thirsty audience that was willing to pay for their beers. Small brewers, like alehouses, began to specialize in simply serving beer, while production breweries got larger and larger and sold their finished beers to the alehouses at very competitive prices. Brewing technology benefited from the Industrial Revolution in many ways. The harnessing of steam power allowed for the automation of various portions of the brewing process, and the invention of the coke oven revolutionized malting and led the way towards producing a cleaner, pale-colored malt that would soon change the way that beer looked and tasted. With its huge and thirsty population, London led the way for the commercialization of brewing. In fact, the first commercially successful beer style, the porter, was named for the large population of common laborers in London, known as porters. Further beer style developments, such as stouts and India Pale Ales, were also centered around London. London was a major shipping hub, and it was from London docks that beer started to get shipped to destinations throughout the British Empire. While other cities also exported beer, London was the early leader, and the export of beer provided a major source of revenue for growing breweries. Burton-on-Trent, or simply Burton, was also a major brewing center that benefited from the Industrial Revolution, although relatively remote Burton had a difficult time competing with London when transportation was factored into the cost of doing business. That changed suddenly as transportation methods improved and when London brewers struggled to supply the beer that was needed for export. When Burton was asked to produce more India Pale Ale, which London brewers couldn't or wouldn't make in sufficient quantities, Burton brewers responded by shifting their massive brewery infrastructure into gear. Burton water, as it turns out, was ideal for producing pale ales that featured hop flavors. Drinkers were delighted with the Burton Pale Ales, and Burton brewers built one of the largest brewing centers in history on the new British taste for pale-colored ales. Scotland is a little too far north to promote good hop growth, so they have largely done without them or with relatively limited quantities that they imported from other areas. England was the logical trading partner for hops, but the Scots' long-standing rivalry with the English limited the amount of trade that took place between the two. For those reasons, Scottish beers have largely developed around rich, malty beers that don't require a lot of hops. Edinburgh, however, made excellent English pale ales as it benefited from having water similar to that of Burton. Brewers in Edinburgh often used more hops than other Scottish brewers as they began to specialize in those English-style pale ales. Once commonplace in Scotland and other parts of the British Isles, the shilling system is still used today to denote the relative strength of Scottish beers. A standard or a light Scottish ale might be classified as a 60 shilling, while a strong Scottish ale, also called a wee heavy, might end up around the 90 shilling mark or higher. The higher the shilling, the stronger the beer. Historically, the shilling designation referred to a price charged for the beer, with the better and stronger ales costing more. The shilling system was once applied to all styles of beer in Scotland, including pale ales, though today it is normally reserved for the dark, rich, malty, traditional Scottish ales. Ireland is a historic brewing country, but it suffers from the same lack of hops as does Scotland. The hop plant is not native to Ireland and doesn't fare well there, though Ireland was more open to importing hops from England than the Scottish were, which kept them well supplied. Ireland became known for brewing ales and began to specialize in brewing a unique style of Irish stout after adopting the porter style from London brewers. The Guinness Brewery in Dublin built much of their business on the porter style in the 18th century, but eventually came to dominate the stout style, which they still specialize in today. Unlike many other countries that relied heavily on England for beer imports, Ireland quickly began brewing enough beer that it became an exporter to England, sending more beer there than they got in return. Over the course of a few centuries, Britain built a strong tradition of brewing ales, but they were not immune to the lager revolution that swept the world in the 20th century. British drinkers resisted the invasion much longer than most other countries, but by the 1970s, beer drinkers in the British Isles had started to turn to modern lagers and started drinking them more often than traditional British beers. in most parts of the country, traditional ales started to fall from favor as large-scale lager brewers made their products very attractive and available to British consumers. Alarmed at the decline in traditional ales, a group of concerned British beer drinkers formed the Campaign for Real Ale, more commonly known as CAMRA. CAMRA was founded in 1971 and has successfully generated interest in maintaining and reviving traditional brewing and beers. Specifically, CAMRA has helped to repopularize traditional real ale, which we will talk about later in this presentation. In recent years, interest in traditional British beers has surged as the craft beer movement has impacted Britain in much the same way that it has impacted the United States and other parts of the world. Many British consumers have found a new interest in the traditional beers of their nation, and the number of small brewers making traditional beers in the British Isles has exploded. The beers of the British Isles range greatly in appearance, aroma, and flavor. Here's a quick synopsis of the traditional British beer styles that we still recognize today, not including some historic styles that are not usually brewed these days, and without the variations on British styles that evolved outside of the British Isles. The Porter is a dark, rich, malt-oriented beer that originated in London. The brown porter version contains a lot of dark, rich malt and features sweet malt flavors like chocolate, caramel, and toffee. The robust porter is generally a stronger version of the brown. Strong versions of porters, called Baltic porters, are popular today, but not typically brewed in England. Stouts evolved from porters, and they are also dark and rich in malt flavors. While stouts did evolve from the porter, stouts typically contain much more coffee-like roasted barley flavor. Many variations of the stout have evolved over time, including the Irish Dry Stout that is still popular today, as well as strong versions intended originally for export, like the Foreign Extra Stout and the Russian Imperial Stout. There are also sweet stouts made with the addition of lactose or milk sugar, and oatmeal stouts that are complex, creamy, and smooth. English pale ales are commonly known as bitters in England. They are usually amber in color and rich in malt character, but they also showcase earthy English hop flavors and bitterness. They are usually very balanced and very drinkable beers that don't range much beyond the 6% in alcohol by volume. Variations of the English pale ale include the standard or ordinary bitter, the special, best, or premium bitter, and the extra special bitter, sometimes known as the strong bitter. Strong ales are among the highest alcohol content British beers. They include the Old Ale and the English barley wine. Old ales are aged at the brewery before being consumed. Some versions of old ales are aged for a long period of time and are known as stock ales. English barley wines are normally the strongest beers brewed by a brewery and are often brewed for consumption in the winter or during the holidays. English brown ales are dark in color and rich in malt flavor, but not nearly as dark or rich as porters and stouts. They lie somewhere between an English pale ale and a porter. Milds are dark but relatively low in alcohol and hop content. Southern English brown ales are rare today but used to be common in southern England. They were normally darker and lower in alcohol than their northern English brown ale counterparts, which are more common today. The northern brown usually features a nutty malt flavor that leads to them being called nut brown ales in some cases. The stereotypical Scottish ale is a dark, rich, malty beer with a taste and aroma of peat. Truth is, not all Scottish ales taste of peat, but in years past, Scottish malt was often dried over open peat fires, which influenced the flavors of their beers. Today, peat-fueled fires are very rare, but the water in Scotland often flows through peat in the ground and can contain a peat character itself, which it can lend to the beer. Peated malt is also rare in Scotland today, though it is relatively commonly used by American brewers when making Scottish-style beers. Cask ale, or real ale, is beer served naturally without any additional additives or processes that might alter the character of the beer. It represents the purest form of the British brewing tradition. It is unfiltered, unpasteurized, and fermented and served from the same container, often called a cask. The cask is never attached to a modern draft system which would force the beer to pour, but might alter its character, so a cask ale flows by pure gravity from the cask. Many different styles of beer can be served as a cask ale, including pale ales, India pale ales, porters, stouts, and milds. It is the container and the process, not the beer style, which makes it cask or real ale. Congratulations, you've finished the module. Hopefully you'll have a few minutes to take the optional quiz that is coming up. Like I said, it's optional, but if you are taking a Beer U curriculum and need to get credit for this module, you'll have to take the quiz and get at least 70% of the answers correct in order to show this module is complete. Good luck!